Please feel free to move about if it makes it easier to see or hear. And Chico, could you help me by, if I'm not speaking loud enough, just raise your hand and I'll try to turn up the volume a little bit. I really appreciate, and we purposely designed this hall to be a certain size to not use amplification. So here we are in COVID, kind of threw us for a little bit of a loop. And so we're working with that a little bit and haven't quite found out the best way to get sound out on the Engawa, but we're still working on it. And everybody who's attending through YouTube, I hope you can hear okay. So when we gather together, one of the first things we do is we offer incense and we make prostrations. Does that freak anybody out? You don't have to raise your hand, but it's a rhetorical question. But I just want to acknowledge that it may feel strange. And I was thinking this morning as we were prostrating, prostration is a discipline that I learned a long time ago. And I'm going to use the word discipline here because it's part of what I want to talk about this morning. A form, a way of practicing, something to come back to again and again. I learned this discipline many, many years ago. And I took to it quite naturally. I'm not sure why. And I'm not saying that's a good thing necessarily. But for me, it felt quite natural. But I am also aware that oftentimes it feels a little funny for people, especially if you haven't been in a culture where bowing is happening very often. In the Japanese culture, you're bowing all the time in a less formal way. But even in sometimes you bow, you would go down to your knees and you place your head on the ground. I had an Indian exchange student once when I was teaching high school, and she said the first thing she did every morning was she'd get up and she would go into the front room. She came from a very aristocratic family. She said the first thing she'd do would be to touch her head to the floor and then to kiss her father's feet. One time I touched her shoes by accident, and I thought she was going to explode because it was such a thing for me to touch her shoes. I was her teacher, so for me to touch her shoes was really not okay culturally. Anyway, you could come to it from a lot of different angles. In some religious traditions, they specifically forbid prostrating or bowing, particularly to an icon on an altar. Right? So there's a lot of ways that you may relate with this. How will we orient our life? This is a fundamental question in a spiritual life. What will be our orientation? And most of the time, we're orienting in the world in a very flat way. We're running into things, and we're trying to figure out what to do with them. And we have some experiences of encountering the same thing or similar things before. Right? And so we try to do the best we can. We try to make the best circumstance in the field that we're in. Right? Meeting something, try to make it this way, try to make it that way. And we try to keep our life together. No blame there. But it's hard to be very successful at it completely. One of the things that a religious tradition offers us is another dimension. That life is not just something which is happening on the two dimensions of our normal way of thinking about things and working with things, but that there is another pole. There is another dimension to how life is operating. So you can think about when you come to the temple and we make prostrations, that's one of the meanings of that, is that it's simply recognizing that there is another pole. Life is not only the kind of give and take of this one terrain or this one plane that we live on, but that there is something else that oftentimes is difficult for us to recognize, difficult for us to see into. And so we give something up in placing our head to the ground. It's not submission like submission to power. It is more like a relinquishment, realizing there is something which I can't see so easily, and an asking to be oriented in a different way. In a very traditional sense, we say that the Buddha always faces south. The Buddha is sitting in the north, facing south. So in the temple, actually, when we're talking about, a little bit like those of you who have been on stage before, if you've been a thespian or worked in theater at all, and you say stage right, stage left, downstage, upstage, those kind of things. The temple's the same way. We say the west, the east, the north, and the south. And then people want to get their compass out, and try to figure out here, which way's north? That way. Geographically, it's that way, all right? Geographically, it's that way. But if you're that kind of person who's oriented that way, you'll say, well, the north is that way. Nope, not at the temple. North is that way. All right? And so whenever you're speaking within a temple complex, even when the feng shui people come, if you're in an East Asian community, before you build anything or anything happens, the person will come with this beautiful big compass. Have people seen that before? It has many layers on it. And they will twist and turn the layers inside of it to figure out what's the most auspicious placement for things. But when you come to the temple, they have to ignore the little magnetic thing in the middle. Right? Because at the temple, the Buddha is always to the north. Well, what is this telling us? Right? It's not a geographical north. Right? It is a spiritual north. There is something, there is another dimension which we are called to, right? And then there is a discipline that reminds us that we can come back to listen for and to recognize this other dimension. So we prostrate and we say, oh, of course, there's a Buddha sitting high on the mountain, Mount Sumeru, right? And constantly illuminating the worlds. The Lotus Sutra speaks of the Buddha being on Vulture Peak throughout all space and time. And there is an illumination that's coming from the curl of hair between his eyes. We might know that as the third eye, or the spiritual seeing. That all universes are illuminated by this. And so this is an image, a kind of gift that the tradition gives us, that when we're sitting here in assembly, when we make prostrations, we're reminded there is illumination. We are there, receiving the illumination of the Buddha and returning that illumination to the Buddha. And because of that, spiritual practice becomes possible. Okay, I was trying not to be too woo-woo, but this is just a plain, I guess, a fact, really, that there is dimensions that we do not see with our physical eyes. And so a spiritual practice is inviting us to a sensitivity to see in this other dimension. Now, Zen practice is famous for being disciplined. And that's what I'd like to talk about this morning, discipline and inspiration. And how we can work with them. The images of a Zen monk, at least in East Asia, are someone who has given up anything that is kind of indulgent. They live with just one robe, a stick, a bowl, and their characters are usually lean and a little ferocious, right? Very to the point. And that they have fully mastered the whims of their own unruly heart. The monkey has been tamed. This is a kind of image that Zen often portrays. It has a positive side and a negative side. Positive side is we should try to overcome the ridiculous way in which we live our life. I want to invite you to that. We are a mess. You are a mess. You are indulgent, you're self-centered, you're complacent. You are all of those things, guaranteed. And we need discipline to be able to face the kind of way in which we will just waste this life with that kind of self-centeredness, indulgence, and laziness. So that's a positive side. It can inspire us, the sense of discipline, to buckle down, to really face the truth of things. But there's a negative side in which the image becomes a kind of abusive image, where we think that the monkey could be tamed with a rod. Now, you might be able to get the monkey to submit. If you work really hard at it, you might get the monkey to just stay in the corner of the cage, right, and never move. But what kind of life would that be? Monkey is a kind of image for your mind, by the way. That hasn't become clear. Your will. So if we just take that image of discipline and we enforce it on ourselves, what we mostly do is we deaden ourselves. We don't become liberated. We become kind of smaller version of who we could be. I'd like to call your mind back to this image of the Buddha sitting on Vulture Peak or the top of Mount Sumeru and looking out over all beings and all of the worlds, and that there's this illumination which reaches through and to all of them. We say that the truth can only be known by a Buddha beholding a Buddha. That a Buddha illuminating, a Buddha seeing, is also seen. That your life, the way that you're called to spiritual uprightness, to a life of integrity, to taking care of what's most important, that isn't just random. That there is actually a Buddha that is you, that is looking at a Buddha that is looking back at you. In Mahayana Buddhism, we call this Buddha nature. And people oftentimes think about Buddha nature as being something we just have. Like, I have a little Buddha inside of me somewhere. That's an okay way to think about it, but it has some problems. Like, if you go around looking for it, you won't find it, right? And you'll think that there's a bad part of you and a good part of you. And if you could just get rid of the bad part of you and keep the good part of you, that's what a Buddha would be. But this Buddha nature is much more profound than that. This Buddha nature is the basis of your consciousness, your capacity to see, your capacity to hear, to smell, to taste, to touch, to conceive, right? To experience things. Mahayana Buddhism tells us, is this Buddha nature? Is a Buddha encountering a Buddha? It was happening all the time. Now, from one angle, we call this a Buddha beholding a Buddha. From another angle, we call it a Buddha looking for a Buddha. The Buddha nature of your own being, looking for awakening. That's what orientation is about. That's what alignment is about. That we look for a Buddha because we are a Buddha. And in that looking, there may be some very pleasant things which are inspiring, and there may be painful things which are inspiring. And both of them are important. That if we're going to come to the discipline of a practice, that we have to pay attention to both. That there are parts of our life that are painful, difficult, and we want to bring a medicine there. And there are parts which are intriguing, enticing, interesting, and we want to inquire and to explore. And this is actually how the teaching happens. The Buddha that's looking for the Buddha has both of these things, both of these kinds of inspirations, right, to help fuel the path. The Buddha looking for the Buddha is the angle at looking at the path. The Buddha beholds the Buddha is just the truth of being. So if we're going to take up an investigation of discipline, investigation of a practice that we can take up and we can bring it into our life and come back to it again and again. That's what I mean by discipline. We have to pay attention to this inspiration. We have to pay attention to there is something looking for something. There is something viewing and something being viewed. there is another dimension to our life that isn't just about getting things arranged correctly. Like, I've been getting my 30 minutes in every day, right? My 30 minutes of meditation in every day. Everything must be good. Actually do that. I encourage you. Sit 30 minutes every day, and then you'll see that everything is not good. It won't actually make everything good. It gives you something much better than everything being good. Right? It gives you an invitation to a path. And that's where discipline can arise from. Not just forcing ourselves to do something that we think is important. Now, Dogen Zenji, who is the founder of this particular school of Buddhism in Japan, Soto Zen Buddhism, in one of his most famous writings, he speaks of Zazen, and he says this: when one displays the Buddha mudra, people know mudra as like a hand sign that the Buddha makes, but the mudra also is any shape that is like spiritually significant. So the Buddha mudra in this case refers to Zazen, or this practice of meditation that's so central to our school. It says, when one displays the Buddha mudra with one's whole body and mind, sitting upright in this samadhi, even for a short time, everything in the entire Dharma world becomes Buddha mudra, and all space in the universe completely becomes enlightenment. Therefore, it enables Buddha Tathagatas to increase the Dharma joy of their own original grounds and renew the adornment of the way of awakening. And it goes on and on like this. I refer to this as the Hallelujah section of the Bendoha. It's so like, I just feel so like, every time I listen to it. So if even for a moment you display this Buddha mudra, that you take up the Buddha mudra with your body and mind, right? The body taking the form of the Buddha, whether that's sitting cross-legged or in a chair, or even standing or lying down. In the display of that mudra, the whole universe is the Buddha mudra. Yeah. This is what Dogen teaches us. And for the whole universe to be the Buddha mudra, it means that the adornment of awakening is flourishing. Think about that, the adornment of awakening. If we go back to that assembly of the Buddha sitting and beholding all the beings in the universe, oftentimes in those sutras, they'll say that there was celestial music and flowers fell, and all the universes will be filled with celestial flowers. That's very beautiful. If you like that kind of thing. Some people, I know it bugs you. That's okay if it bugs you, right? But that's adornment, right? That is, things have a luminosity to them that they don't have otherwise. Right? They're not just opaque objects of your subjectivity. They're not just things for you to dodge or set up right, but that they are adorned with the marks of awakening, just as they are. That's the quality of this upright sitting of Zazen. Now, Zazen is just a word. And just like that image, that very disciplined image of the Zen monk can get in the way, the word Zazen can really get in the way. Because if I say Zazen, you will think, oh, meditation. And you'll say, oh, I know what meditation is. No, you don't. I hope you don't. I mean, maybe you think you know what meditation is, but once you know what it is, you can't do it anymore. Once you know what it is, it's no longer a real activity. That's not discipline. Discipline isn't doing something you know how to do, right? Discipline here is being willing to encounter something that you don't know. And the not knowing it is an invitation again and again and again and again. This is actually what makes meditation so challenging. I tried to exercise every day. And I could do it, actually. I'm not right now. Have you guys heard that joke? People say, quitting smoking is easy. I've done it tons of times. Kind of like that. But this is actually different. It's not just like forcing yourself to do something that you think is good for you. Now, there can be a little taste of that in there. You're like, oh, okay, I got it. I know I decided I'm going to do this. I got to do it. That could be there. And that is an important aspect. right? Just kind of forcing yourself to do something. That's a side of discipline, but it's a very thin part of discipline. The deeper part of discipline is facing something which you can't control. You don't even know what it is. And being willing to say, I will arrive with my hands empty. I will arrive unguarded so that I can look clearly into something which is not just under the domain of my power. This is what makes the discipline of Zazen so challenging. More challenging than things that we learn to do and then do them over and over for good results. Because Zazen is not just a word, is a gateway. This mudra that Dogen Zenji is speaking about here in this writing is not just a physical adherence to the physical form of meditation. It is that Buddha sitting there on Vulture Peak and all of us receiving and returning the illumination, which is not caught by time or space, is happening everywhere all the time. And yet it's very hard for us to rely on it. It's very hard for us to wake up to it. So Zazen is about that gateway, a gateway that's never left you, a gateway in which all things return and all things emerge. So I have this kind of image in my mind that I'd like to give you. If all of that sounds a little bit confusing or kind of over the top in terms of religious content. This time of year, I hope you do this. If you don't, I will encourage you to do it. Sit by the window and open it. If you have a window in your house, hopefully you're not in one of those houses where none of the windows open. If you are, there's always hammers. They do a pretty good job. Have some experience with that. If you ever go into the bathroom down here and you're like, why is there a gaping hole in the, they built a bathroom without any opening windows when we first moved here 20-some years ago, and I just couldn't deal with it, so I had a hammer. So I took out a couple of the glass blocks, so now we have a hole. Anyway, sit by a window, you know. Don't make it complicated, don't bring a magazine. If you have to have a cup of coffee or tea, you can, but I'd encourage you to leave that aside too. If you have normal windows in Western type house, bring a chair so you can be close to the window, not like just sitting down on the ground. If you have one of these windows that's nice that comes down to the ground, you can sit on the zafu or something like that. Don't try to meditate. Don't try to make it something other than just sitting by the window. I encourage you to do this in the morning, in the evening, when the temperature is changing. Just feel. What is it like? The out and the in. The inseparability of being, which is there at the window. Just to be there and enjoy that threshold. This is a lot what Zazen is like. There's a great freedom there by that window. To see in and to see out and to see that they reflect each other. It's very simple. Almost impossible to do. See, because our mind is so used to dividing things. This is what the Buddha called delusion. It's not that there are no things which are large and no things that are small. To see large and to see small is not delusion. But to try to divide or to separate large and small, that's delusion. How do we separate them? Right? We say, oh, the large thing is important. The small thing is unimportant. Anyone ever see those tiny, tiny carvings that a British man makes? I forget his name now. I used to show them to my students when I taught middle school. So that was maybe 15 years ago. I'm sure he's still on YouTube somewhere. He makes these out of metal. He uses like gold or silver. I guess that's the kind of material that is possible with. And he carves, so one of his jokes is he carved all these angels dancing on the pin of a needle, or the head of a needle. You know, like what is that? Like how many angels can dance on the, and yeah. So he made, and there's like 12 of them or something. But, I mean, we're talking really tiny. You have to have, when they display them in the art gallery, they have a microscope to be able to see them. And he carved these tiny, tiny, tiny little things. And when I asked him why he carved things so tiny, he said, when I was in school, he has some learning disabilities, and he said, when I was in school, that everyone made me feel small. And I'm here to prove there's no such thing as small. And that's what he was doing. So amazing. You could these things. He said when he was painting them, he had to touch them in between the heartbeats because he couldn't get enough precision. So he had to take up this yogic practice of learning to slow his pulse down and then to touch with the brush. He would pull a little hair off of a fly for his brush, and then he would paint. He would paint them. Anyway, if that sounds interesting to you, go look on YouTube. You'll find all about it. It's cool. One time he said he was making Alice in Wonderland, and then he breathed in, and she just disappeared. He said that was a mistake. It was like a month of work or whatever, and he just breathed in, and she was gone. But the reason I love that story is because that's how it is. I mean, the more you look at anything, the more detail is there. That our idea of great and small, of large and small, the part of our mind that wants to divide the two is really about importance. It's really about what am I going to pay attention to? What shows up on the level of my conventional activity, which I'm going to deem as important. Now, things that are too large, they sort of go out of focus too, right? Like, say, the solar system, which none of us have ever seen. Couldn't see. Or even the earth. Probably even, our town, or even this building we're sitting in. We have an idea that we know where we are, but it's just a kind of idea. So this kind of dividing mind that wants to take one thing and the other thing and say one's big, one's small, and then to separate it apart, this kind of delusion is the very thing that the Buddha Mudra is inviting us to release. To say, do not consider the large to be large in absence of the small. Don't think of the small as being small in absence of the large. The two completely rely on each other. Now, when we're just talking about physical size, maybe we can say, oh yeah, that's fine, I can get to that. But when it comes to our spiritual life, or it comes to our life just at all, and sometimes I don't even really like the word spiritual, when it comes to our life, we are completely fraught with this. Dividing out what is large and small, caring for what is large, dismissing what is small. And so the Buddha Mudra, the Zazen, the Buddha in us that is looking for the Buddha, is inviting us to pay attention to the Buddhahood of everything that we meet. It's inviting us not to say the Buddha is in this place where things are really important, is not in this place where things are small. This is where real discipline emerges from. And I'm calling it in these talks a discipline of care versus a discipline of domination. A discipline of domination is the kind of discipline when we say, okay, I know what the Buddha Mudra is, I read it in the book, or I went to Introduction to Zazen, I got trained in what it looks like to meditate, and now I'm going to inflict that on myself. In a way, if you can do that, it's the easy way out. It's the easy way out of a complex, rich, dynamic, challenging life. Right? To think, I just have this medicine, I'm just going to put it on here and squish everything. Because we actually can't get out. That kind of dominating thinking will just end up in more and more suffering. And so that's why I said earlier, in inspiration, there's part that is painful, and there's part that is inspiring or even pleasurable. The part that is painful is teaching us about the nature of our mind. It's teaching us about how we consider things. It's encouraging us to not split apart the painful from the meaningful or the pleasurable, and to see where is my next step. Discipline not as domination, but discipline as caring for. It's paying attention to. This isn't mushy or flaky. It's where kind of true strength can emerge from. You know, the kind of effort that we put into things where we're going to force it is always going like this. Do you notice that in yourself? You say, I'm going to do this. And you get the energy together and you force yourself in, go, and then you go to this kind of breaking point. And then you fall off. Right? And then you let it all go. Well, that's because you haven't learned about the fire. When you're making things out of copper, and you beat them into shape. Has anyone done that before? It's really fun. If you get a chance, I encourage you. So you get a copper and you beat it into shape. Maybe you make a bowl or maybe you make a teapot or something like that. After you hit it for a while, it won't change shape anymore. It just gets more and more brittle. And then eventually when you hit it, it will just break. So what you have to do is you have to hit it for a while, and then you have to put it in fire, and it gets red, it has to turn red hot, and then you cool it down again. This is cold forging, not hot forging, like when you're doing steel or something, you use hot forging, but for copper, you use cold forging. And it's kind of amazing when you do it, because the thing that was all brittle and wouldn't change shape now is very soft. And you can hammer it, and it starts to take shape again. And then you can create the shape that you want. So discipline includes forcing yourself to do something. I don't want to shy from that. But if you only force yourself to do something, and you don't know about the fire of inspiration, you don't know about the fire that is burning inside of you, that is looking for something, then you only start to hammer something that can't change shape. You need both. You need to make the decisive decision to strike somewhere, but you also need to bring the fire in to help your life transform. You know, the sharpest blades are not only hard steel, they're hard and soft. Right? So we have a sword maker here. He knows. They're hard and soft. And that comes from layers and layers and layers. Not only the Japanese found this out. Spanish steel, for example, is famous for being like that. So that's what discipline offers us. It has softness, has hardness. And that's what brings about the sharpness of spirit that can cut through the delusion that causes us so much suffering. Now, I'm not so sure if I'm making any sense, but I'll say one last thing and then we'll give it up. One of the most famous stories in Zen Buddhism is the first transmission of the Dharma from the Buddha Shakyamuni to Mahakashapa. Mahakashapa is here on the Buddha's left, directly to the Buddha's left. There's a figure, he has a staff and rings. Mahakashapa was one of the close disciples of the Buddha Shakyamuni. And the thing we oftentimes forget to say when retelling this story about his receiving of the Dharma from the Buddha is Mahakashapa was the foremost in discipline. It's very important for our school to remember that. Mahakashapa was not just, oh yeah, someone needed to do it, so it might as well be Mahakashapa. Mahakashapa had undertaken the severe disciplines that the Buddha allowed. The Buddha didn't allow his disciples, his renunciate disciples, to take up overly ascetic practices, because he had done that and he saw how they were just like self-mortification wasn't the way to liberation. So he said, no, you can't do that. But he said you should live like this. Very simple renunciate life. A bowl, a robe, a needle to mend your robe, a straw to filter water. Right? And they lived very simple life and received food from the community to live. But there was always this pressure for more discipline. You know those people? You know, they're helpful and unhelpful at the same time. They're always kind of pushing for more, kind of more discipline. I imagine Mahakashapa was one of those people. And so the Buddha had another set of rules that were allowed. They weren't required, but they were allowed. And some of them were like only taking one meal a day, for example. Generally, the renunciates they just were not to eat after midday, but to only take one meal a day. To mix your food rather than to keep it separated. That was one of the disciplines. So they seem very small to us, but if your life was made up of just having a bowl and a robe and you received food and meditated all day and ate the food, that probably would be a really big deal. Like, is your food mixed together or your food not mixed together? Anyway, Mahakashapa was the foremost in discipline. And one day it said that the Buddha sat, as was the practice, after the midday meal, to offer a teaching to the assembly. And so the assembly was all there. The Buddha took his appointed seat and said that he picked up a flower and he just softly twirled it in his right hand between his thumb and his finger. And Mahakashapa smiled. And the Buddha said, I entrust the wondrous mind of nirvana to you, Mahakashapa. And that was the end of the assembly. So with this story, its most common way to interpret is that the transmission is beyond words. That the Buddha wasn't going to say anything. He was just silence. There was just a flower there. That was it. And that's the way that the Buddha Dharma travels to us, is without reliance on scripture, just in the simple silence of being. And while I think that interpretation has its place, I'd like you to consider this story in a slightly different way. This isn't a story in which the Buddha just happens to pick up a flower. I ask you, when you think of your own awakening, you think of your own life, how big is it compared to a flower? How much more regard do you have for it? How much more care do you give to it? With a kind of implicit attitude that, a flower is nice. But a flower is just a flower. It's small. That this wondrous mind of nirvana that the Buddha entrusted to Mahakashapa was this flower. The flower wasn't a symbol. The flower wasn't just something the Buddha happened to have. It was the wondrous mind of awakening. It is the wondrous mind of awakening. That flower is right there in the Buddha's hand, atop that mountain. And I want you to know that. that's why I care about this temple and why I care about the practices, because they are a gateway. They're not the only gateway, but they are a gateway in which you can be invited to put aside the divisions of your heart and to care for your life in a real, direct, but not so obvious way. Buddha